They said the V-twin would never die until this ghost engine buried it alive. No chrome, no heritage badge, just raw power rewriting the rules of the road. What happened next shook Harley to its core. Watch till the end, because by the time you hear what's coming next, you'll wish you were already ahead of it. What's happening? The Nevada air was dry enough to crack lips, the kind of sun-bleached afternoon where track days feel less like competition and more like a family reunion for riders. Folding chairs lined the paddock, coolers sat under pop-up tents, and conversations hummed over the faint smell of gasoline and sunscreen. Harley riders in worn leather swapped stories with Yamaha owners tuning their machines, while a lone Suzuki with a turbo kit sat gleaming under the watchful eyes of its proud builder. It was a comfortable, predictable kind of day, the sort that repeats itself across the country every weekend. Then, without fanfare, a matte black bike rolled off a trailer near the far end of the lot. It had no badges, no decals, not even the faintest nod to a brand. Its paint seemed to swallow the sunlight instead of reflecting it, and the absence of chrome made it almost blend into the asphalt. Most people barely looked up. It didn't demand attention. Not yet. When the rider finally mounted, a few curious eyes followed, but it was the ignition that pulled the first real glance. The sound wasn't the sharp bark of a race-tuned inline four, nor the deep, uneven thump of a big Harley V-twin. It was lower, denser, a frequency that seemed to rumble more in the chest than in the ears. The ground underfoot seemed to flex with each pulse. A few old hands muttered about bored-out Harleys with custom pipes, but they were guessing. No one really knew. As the bike rolled out of pit lane, there was no wheelie, no tire squeal, just an uncanny stability. The forks compressed hard under torque, the frame squatted into the tarmac, and then it launched. The speed came without drama, without the usual fight against gravity. It simply surged forward, swallowing the straight in seconds. By the time it passed the far end, the conversations had stopped. It returned for another lap, faster this time, smooth as water over glass. And when it rolled back into the pits, the rider shut it down without a word, dismounted, and walked away. Nobody asked anything, and nobody needed to. They had just seen something they couldn't unsee, and no one knew they'd just witnessed history collapse. But the real shock wouldn't come from watching. It would come from measuring. And if you're watching this and you've got an opinion about the future of the V-twin, hit that like button so we know you're here, and drop your take in the comments. Is this a revolution or just hype? Breaking the numbers. In the hours after the matte black bike had left the track, a strange silence hung in the paddock. It wasn't the end-of-day fatigue that usually sets in. It was the weight of a collective question nobody could answer. Then one of the riders, still holding his stopwatch, broke it. He had clocked the second lap. The time he called out didn't make sense, not for a bike anyone could buy. It was well clear of the best laps set by production-class V-twins, even the most aggressively tuned Harleys. Word spread fast. A pair of riders pulled out their phones to cross-check with onboard footage. The numbers matched. By the time evening settled, whispers had turned into quiet debates. Maybe it was a heavily modified S&S motor or a custom Harley V-rod stripped down for racing. One younger rider swore it had to be a Frankenstein build, mixing parts from different performance lines. But no matter how they spun it, the performance didn't fit. The dyno test the next day settled it. The black bike's torquey curve spiked and held with a steadiness that simply didn't exist in the V-twin world. There was no dramatic drop-off, no narrow band of power, just a relentless plateau of force. It pulled like an electric motor, but with the raw mechanical growl of combustion. It wasn't just quick for its class, it was rewriting what the class meant. Every known benchmark had been obliterated, and there wasn't a single Harley, Indian, or Ducati Phi-twin configuration that could touch it without losing in multiple categories: torque, efficiency, and consistency. And when people finally asked the question that mattered, where did this thing come from? The answer wasn't in Milwaukee, it was locked away overseas. And the key to that locked door was a story nobody inside the paddock could have guessed. While the old guard fights to keep up, you can already ride smarter. Check the description for gloves, jackets, and road gear I've tested myself. Built for the next chapter, not the last. Ghost Foundry. The truth began not in a workshop filled with grease and banners, but in a quiet, forgotten wing of a Japanese manufacturing giant. Shinsei Motors. Known publicly for its hybrid sedans and whisper-quiet electric scooters, Shinsei was as far from the rebel image of big displacement motorcycles as a corporation could get. But inside its walls, a small group of mid-level engineers was growing restless. 5 years earlier, they had watched the motorcycle industry stall. In America, Harley-Davidson doubled down on heritage, more chrome, more nostalgia, while other brands played it safe. For riders hungry for something truly new, the choices were evaporating. Shinsei's board refused to even discuss combustion innovation. Electric was the future, they said, and nothing else deserved the budget. So the engineers stopped asking, and they started building. They found their refuge in a mothballed annex of one of Shinsei's older plants, a space left to gather dust after the last restructuring. They called themselves Project Yurei, Japanese for ghost, because no one was supposed to know they existed. They bought parts with personal funds, shipped deliveries to their home addresses, and ran their tests after hours. Every decision was fueled not by profit, but by obsession. Their goal wasn't to outdo the V-twin, it was to erase it. They wanted to show that combustion engines could evolve past nostalgia, that they could be cleaner, faster, more efficient, and more exciting than anything on the road. This was their rebellion. By the time Shinsei leadership discovered the project, the prototype was already outperforming every engine in their official catalog. To everyone's surprise, the executives didn't kill it. They greenlit it quietly with one instruction: build it right. And building it right meant breaking every rule the industry thought was sacred. Rewriting physics. When Project Yurei was freed from secrecy, the engineers didn't just push the limits, they redrew them. They abandoned legacy oil-based cooling and replaced it with a split-phase liquid loop that cut thermal strain by over 40%. They lined the combustion chamber with aerospace-grade carbon nanotubes, allowing compression ratios most engineers considered impossible without catastrophic pre-ignition. The intake system became an adaptive geometry array, adjusting in real time to RPM load, throttle position, and ambient conditions. The ECU was not just mapped, it was neural-assisted, capable of learning a rider's habits and evolving with them. No two rides were identical, yet everyone delivered the perfect power profile. Even the sound was deliberate. The exhaust was tuned to hit subharmonics that resonated more in a rider's body than their ears, creating an emotional connection that went beyond noise. And while regulators searched for loopholes, they found none. Yurei passed Euro 5 and carb with room to spare. This wasn't a hot rod, it was a scalpel. Every choice was intentional, every component a strike against the conventions that had defined motorcycles for decades. And yet, the most devastating blow to the V-twin world wasn't any of these innovations. Then they set the price, and the market convulsed. Price tag ambush. They did not drop a product, they detonated a price. An $8,000 crate engine, fully tuned, fully legal, truly plug-and-play, arrived like a thunderclap, set deliberately against Harley's own path where a comparable big-power setup meant paying over $11,000 before installation and then shelling out for additional tuning and hardware. In a single announcement, the arithmetic that fed the aftermarket for decades snapped. The margins that kept cam kits, pipes, and race maps alive began collapsing overnight. The shock was not just sticker math, it was value density. Riders who had spent winters wrenching and summers chasing incremental gains suddenly saw a straight line to output that once demanded a Frankenstein's buffet of parts. For shop owners, the ledger turned menacing. Inventory that looked like money on shelves yesterday looked like a museum today. Cash flow projections that depended on staged upgrade ladders. Stage 1, Stage 2, and the rest of the pilgrimage lost their rungs in an afternoon. Then came the quiet cancellations, the sheepish phone calls, the emails with subject lines like, "holding off for now." Deposits for heritage builds paused as riders asked an unforgivable question. Why pay more for less heat management, less consistency, and less headroom? The new engine did not promise romance, it promised results, and it priced those results like a dare. Shops that once sold identity now had to defend inefficiency, and the argument sounded thin even to loyal ears. In parking lots and comment threads, a new refrain surfaced. The future is cheaper and faster, and it bolts right in. Bargains rarely rewrite cultures, but this one began to. The sticker was not just a number, it was a verdict. Harley reached for their oldest weapon, the narrative. Spin cycle. The first response was not a counterpunch, it was a chorus. Heritage, soul, real riders. These phrases marched out of press releases and onto talk show couches with the rhythm of a metronome, confident that language could outpace lap times. The official line dismissed Uri as a stunt, a lab queen that could not survive the grime and boredom of real miles, a trick of tech that would wither outside the spotlight. On paper, it sounded familiar and safe. In practice, it sounded rehearsed. The internet refused to clap on cue. Viral teardowns rolled out with pitiless calm. Dyno pulls recorded from multiple angles, thermal cameras lingering on head temperatures, data log overlays showing torque that arrived like a freight train and stayed for the party. Reviewers who usually spoke in adjectives started speaking in curves and traces, and those curves made the spin look silly. The more soul showed up in quotations, the more the word proof showed up in captions. Cynicism metastasized where loyalty used to live. Riders did not stop loving memory, they just stopped mistaking it for physics. The spin asked them to ignore numbers, and numbers are hard to ignore when you can watch them climb on a screen in slow motion. Even dealers felt the ground tilt. Reps recited talking points about authenticity, while customers held out phones playing side-by-side pulls, and the room filled with a kind of embarrassed air. The brand had long understood story better than anyone, but the medium had changed. Story now lived in frame-by-frame breakdowns and time slips rather than slogans. The attempt to reframe the moment as a lifestyle dispute only sharpened the contrast. One side was speaking poetry, the other was showing measurements. The applause line fell flat, and the crowd looked toward the building where decisions actually happen. Inside the boardroom, the real fight began. Boardroom civil war. The meeting invites looked routine. The mood was anything but. A younger bloc argued for a hard pivot toward innovation, not as a betrayal of the crest, but as its only survival path. Pare down weight, modernize architecture, embrace a new performance identity, and make the first machine that speaks fluent future while still nodding at the past. Across the table, the old guard drew a bright line. Double down on tradition, protect the ceremony, guard the cadence of the V-twin as if it were a national anthem. If you chase the interloper, you confess the throne is empty. Proposals ricocheted, a parallel sub-brand shielded from legacy expectations, a co-developed platform with a domestic tech partner to borrow time and credibility, a stopgap licensing arrangement to satisfy customers hungry for numbers while internal teams retool. Each idea carried promise and peril. Each required trust that had evaporated the moment the gimmick outpulled the home team on camera. The more options appeared, the less alignment existed to choose any of them. What no slide could express was the fear of dissonance. If the company built a modern power plant that genuinely competed with Uri, would it still be the same company in the eyes of the faithful? And if it refused to, would it still deserve the faith? The brand had always been a covenant. We build you a feeling, you build us a culture. Now that covenant read like a contract with clauses nobody wanted to test in court. Deadlines slipped while the debate replayed. Procurement asked for direction. Engineering asked for authority. Marketing asked for a miracle. The only thing moving quickly was the story outside the building where riders were their own focus groups. Tension curdled into paralysis, and paralysis has a way of choosing for you. If they could not outrun Uri, maybe they could outlaw it. Paper bullets. When Torquay will not bend, paperwork might. Lobbyists scheduled quiet briefings with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, and the California Air Resources Board, not to accuse but to inquire in a tone tuned for doubt. How did an engine this potent clear emissions so quickly? Were cold start validations independently replicated on domestic soil? Was the neural-assisted control unit truly locked against post-sale tampering that could spike output beyond certification thresholds? Questions are not handcuffs, but they can slow a door. Shinsei answered by switching on all the lights. Data packages appeared online with lab timestamps, calibration notes, and chain of custody logs. Video tours guided regulators through test cells and benches, engineers fielding questions without translators or hedges. Invitations went out for on-site verification with the kind of confidence that only arrives when you believe your numbers will survive fresh eyes. The posture was not defiant, it was surgical. Public patience for procedural ambushes had thinned. Riders who might once have shrugged at a pause now saw it as gamesmanship, and they said so loudly. The narrative flipped from mysterious outsider to transparent disruptor, while the legacy player looked like it was fishing for a technicality to delay the inevitable. Paper bullets shredded into confetti under the weight of documents, and frustration multiplied where certainty used to sit. The tactic failed to stop the march, but it did something worse to the old guard. It revealed fear. If you try to win in committee, you admit you are losing in the showroom. And when the committees stand down, you are left with an audience that has watched you flinch. The policy skirmish ended without trophies, and the noise migrated from offices to streets, forums, and dealer floors. People were not done riding. They were done pretending that the old ladder still reached the roof. Then came the leak. The Great Leak. First came rumors of encrypted forums humming after midnight, then the appearance of files that looked like fiction. URI CAD models zipped, hashed, mirrored, and seeded by users whose screen names felt like masks. Within 48 hours, spelled out 48, engineers and hackers swarmed the blueprints, annotating coolant paths, arguing over combustion geometry, tracing the neural-assisted control logic as if it were a new dialect. The leak did not arrive with a press conference. It arrived like rain through a cracked roof, everywhere at once, unstoppable and annoyingly ordinary. Chaos rarely sounds like shouting, it sounds like keyboards. Across Europe, California, and Asia, small teams dragged the files into their software, trying to understand not just what was there, but why it worked. Some found dead ends and posted them so others would not waste time. Some found minor victories, machining a housing here, prototyping an active intake vein there, coaxing a benchtop rig to breathe for a few glorious seconds before it coughed smoke and lessons. Every hour translated to someone else's shortcut. Years of R&D condensed into a community theater of ambitious amateurs and suspiciously competent professionals. For Shinsei, the legal response was necessary and useless. Takedown notices chased mirrors that spawned more mirrors. A stern letter is a net thrown at water. It proves effort, but catches nothing. The company pivoted to strategy. Publish more of what could not be faked. Lab runs, emissions footage, calibration proofs, so that the market would prefer the original to the remix. Yet the clones kept advancing, not identical, not legal in every jurisdiction, but close enough to prove a terrifying law of motion. Once an idea escapes, ownership becomes narrative rather than possession. The chaos did not flatten the landscape, it fractured it. Suddenly, the question was not whether the design could be copied, but who would claim the right to define its meaning. And the debate over combustion's future went political. Combustion's political trial. The hearing did not happen in a single room, it happened everywhere policy breathes. NGOs wrote white papers questioning whether an engine this clean and this powerful was a regression disguised as progress. Lawmakers asked for briefings in Brussels, in Berlin, in Sacramento, framing the question less as compliance and more as consensus. If the future had already been declared electric, what did it mean for a combustion miracle to barge through the narrative? Environmental boards scheduled additional inspections, not because the first results were suspect, but because time can be a tactic. The phrase from Brussels, regression disguised as progress, stuck because it was elegant. It implied that facts must kneel to direction, that a better engine might still be a worse idea. The counter-argument required more than a spec sheet. Shinsei's communications team went on the offensive with a defiance that felt disarmingly calm. They published life cycle analyses that treated emissions like accountants treat cash flow, tracing inputs and outputs from mine to scrap. They argued that resource intensity matters, that power density matters, that transitional architectures can lower real-world emissions while infrastructure catches up to ambition. The public did not read every chart, but they saw the posture. Not cowed, not cagey, not hiding behind lawyers. Engineers spoke plainly in interviews, explaining why the split-phase cooling loop reduced thermal stress and why the neural-assisted ECU did not merely learn the rider, but protected the engine from the rider's worst habits. They invited regulators to their labs and live-streamed the visits. They framed their machine not as a rebellion against the future, but as a bridge wide enough for millions to cross without falling. Policy rarely rewards defiance, yet sometimes defiance reframes policy. The trial of combustion did not declare a winner. It declared a reckoning. Meanwhile, Harley's own workforce was reaching a breaking point. Unions' new fight. Inside Harley's domestic plants, the sound of machinery was still there, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had once been prideful chatter between shifts now carried an edge, a current of something harder. Workers with 20 or 30 years of loyalty began pressing for answers that management would not give. Would the Uri engine eat into their jobs? Would Harley try to cut costs by moving production offshore? Would the next platform even exist? The questions were not about small changes, they were about survival. Union leaders, sensing the unrest, called emergency meetings in break rooms and local halls. The tone was no longer about wages or benefits, the traditional battlegrounds of labor disputes. This time, the demands were strategic. Workers wanted a clear plan for innovation, something that would keep Harley competitive against a machine that had turned the industry upside down. When leadership stonewalled, citing ongoing market review and confidential future developments, frustration hardened into resolve. A bold proposal emerged from a small but vocal faction. If Harley's leadership refused to evolve, the union should push for partnerships with outside tech firms, even foreign ones, to integrate new engine technology. The idea was radical, almost unthinkable in a company steeped in tradition, and it set off internal tremors. Within weeks, 3 local-level union officers resigned in protest, unable to support what they saw as a betrayal of heritage. But for others, the suggestion was a lifeline. If Harley would not lead the future, maybe it could at least join it. The divide ran deep, but the movement had momentum. Picket signs began appearing not against corporate greed, but against corporate denial. "Innovate or vacate," read one scrawled in bold black letters. It was a warning, but also a dare. And while the executives upstairs still debated brand identity, the people on the floor had already chosen sides. But the market had already voted. Numbers don't lie. The quarterly sales data was blunt, merciless. Harley's core model sales were down 17% in just 3 months. The once dominant Softail line was losing ground to mid-weight imports and stripped-down Street Fighter hybrids. But the most telling number wasn't about units, it was about people. For the first time in the company's history, the average Harley buyer was now 58 years old. The brand's customer base was literally aging out. In stark contrast, Shinsei's Uri-equipped models had sold out across every single dealership they touched, from Berlin to Boston. Wait lists were stretching past 6 months in some regions. More surprising still, the people putting down deposits were not grizzled veterans with garages full of chrome. Many were under 30. Many had never owned a motorcycle before. The Uri wasn't just attracting riders, it was creating them. Analysts called it a generational migration. The younger demographic didn't care about heritage plaques or the shape of an engine casing. They cared about performance, price, and a brand that spoke their language. To them, the Uri was a clean slate. For Harley, it was a red flag. Financing incentives, dealer discounts, and bundled upgrade packages barely made a dent in the losses. Even loyalists were hesitating, calculating what they could get for the same money elsewhere. As these numbers circulated through industry reports and investor calls, they became more than statistics. They became a verdict. Harley wasn't just losing customers, it was losing cultural relevance. And politicians saw their opening. If you want to be the first to know what Shinsei does next, and what Harley's counterpunch might look like, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next chapter in this story is already unfolding, and you don't want to be the last to hear it. Tariff tensions. The political reaction began quietly as whispers in committee rooms and trade forums. Then it broke into the open. Senators from Wisconsin and Michigan, long seen as guardians of American manufacturing, called for a 25% import tax on all Shinsei engines and parts. The argument was simple: protect domestic industry from unfair foreign competition. In speeches, they invoked American pride, legacy, and the preservation of jobs in the heartland. But the push landed poorly on the global stage. Japan, Shinsei's home turf, called the move political theater in response to market disruption. Germany labeled it thinly veiled protectionism that threatened broader trade relations. Brazil, an emerging motorcycle hub with growing ties to Shinsei, went further, warning of retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. The backlash turned what could have been a domestic rallying cry into a diplomatic headache. Shinsei did not respond with speeches, they responded with action. Shipments to U.S. ports slowed, officially due to logistical reevaluation, but insiders knew it was a calculated squeeze. Meanwhile, in Europe and Asia, Shinsei accelerated dealership certifications and expanded distribution. Where the U.S. hesitated, other markets embraced the disruptor without a second thought. Inside Washington, trade economists issued quiet warnings. Targeting Shinsei after it had cleared every regulatory hurdle would alienate the very younger riders the industry needed to survive. Worse, it risked turning the Yuri into a symbol of progress denied by politics. But culture was already riding ahead of policy. The shift rides on. The rebellion no longer belonged to Harley. Across Instagram, TikTok, and countless local message boards, a new riding identity was forming under the banner of The Shift. It wasn't organized in clubs or bound by tradition. It was fluid, spontaneous, and unapologetically forward-facing. Riders in their 20s were lining up for test rides not because they had a lifelong dream of owning a bike, but because the Yuri made that dream feel relevant. From Oakland to Osaka, pop-up ride-outs began taking over city streets. No brand sponsorships, no official merchandise, just riders sharing a time and place, showing up and taking over for a few hours before disappearing back into the city's veins. Videos of these events racked up millions of views, each one making the Yuri less of a product and more of a movement. One clip from Chicago went viral, a 24-year-old woman, helmet in hand, saying, "My dad rides a Harley. I ride what's next." For older generations, it was a disorienting sight. The roar of the V-twin, once a symbol of rebellion, was now being replaced by a deeper, sharper sound that meant the opposite of nostalgia. For the younger riders, it was liberation, from old rules, old expectations, and the weight of heritage that no longer spoke to them. They weren't rejecting motorcycles, they were rewriting what it meant to ride one. If you want to be the first to know what Shinsei does next and what Harley's counterpunch might look like, make sure you're subscribed because the next chapter in this story is already unfolding and you don't want to be the last to hear it. Smash that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive, drop a comment with your take on the future of the V-twin, and share this with a friend who needs to see what's coming. The road ahead is about to get wild. Let's ride it together.